Ethics Initiative. Funding has come from a donation to Merton College, Oxford, in honor of Professor Henry Shue, in recognition of his groundbreaking work on issues of contemporary concern, including nuclear weapons. Oxford Security and Politics Initiative is a new initiative spearheaded by Dr. Cheney Ryan, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Underwood, and myself. It is focused on bringing together the various agencies within the spaces of ethics, law, security, and policy here at Oxford for the purpose of anticipating and getting ahead of some of the major future ethical challenges of the 21st century. This initiative is a work in progress, and we therefore welcome and encourage everyone's participation and contributions as we move forward with this project. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Dapo Kande. Dapo is the co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict and professor of law at the Blavatnik School of Government. Dapo.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. I think it's traditional when one is introducing a talk to say that the topic could not be more important, to say that the speaker could not be better qualified to address the topic, but then to go ahead and justify the importance of the speaker and the topic after doing that. But on this occasion, it really is the case that this is the topic of the day. I can assure you that we had nothing to do with the events of the last 24 hours to ensure that this would really be the topic of the day, but the topic could not be more important and could not be one which is more pressing for today. And our speaker, Professor Scott Sagan, could not be better qualified to speak to us about this. Professor Sagan is professor at Stanford University. He has written numerous books on nuclear strategy, nuclear weapons, nuclear safety. He has a distinguished track record in academia. His books have won numerous awards. I was thinking about how many awards you've won in the last year and a bit on this topic and on other issues. And also, he has combined his academic work on the topic with work in government. So in addition to his academic work, he has served in a couple of roles, or more than a couple of roles, in the U.S. Department of Defense, as consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's worked in the organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S., and we really are very grateful to him for coming to speak to us on this topic. So, Scott, thank you very much.
Well, we're very pleased. Thank you, Daryl, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. Let me make sure that everyone in the back can hear me. There you can. Good. This is not going to be an upbeat talk. If there's humor, it will be black humor, because I'm scared. We're in a very troubled time with respect to this crisis between the United States and North Korea, or between the international community and North Korea. And I'm reminded that my friend and late colleague, General John Shalikashvili, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that he would sometimes ask his soldiers before they went into combat, "Are you scared?" And brash young soldiers would say, "No, I'm not scared, sir." And he said, "You should be scared, because having some fear makes you act more wisely." So I think that if you're not scared today, you're probably not taking what's going on seriously enough, and that we as a society, as a global society, or you in your country, or me and Americans in our country, need to get more serious about these particular worrisome events. And I used the title of the Korean Missile Crisis deliberately to evoke the Cuban Missile Crisis as an analogy. Many scholars have argued that what we're witnessing is like the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. I think they're wrong. It's worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's at Twitter speed sometimes, not in slow motion. Cuba was very dangerous, more dangerous than we now know than we knew at the time. But in at least 3 ways, Today's crisis is worse. In 1962, Fidel Castro advocated the use of nuclear weapons, we now know. And he acknowledged that in 2002 when I was with the Kennedy administration, senior leadership, visiting him in Havana, telling Nikita Khrushchev that I think the Americans are about to attack and this is our last chance. We should launch everything we have and everything you have against the United States and wipe it off. Castro said that he acknowledged doing that and said he thought the right thing to do given what was going on. But Castro didn't have his own nuclear weapons in 1962. The Soviets had some on the island and had the rest in the Soviet Union. Today, in contrast to 1962, in 2018, Kim Jong-un already has nuclear weapons. By U.S. estimates, some 40 to 60. Still difficult to know because you just have to estimate how much is in individual weapons, given how much plutonium and uranium enrichment. We don't know how much uranium enrichment they've actually successfully done. The yields are way beyond, with the last test, the Hiroshima-type bombs that they started out with in 2006. Current estimates are 200 to 250 kiloton weapons in the last test. So that's the first difference, why it's worrisome. Second, in 1962, we had one rational, ruthless, but occasionally rash leader, Fidel Castro, and two, I think, quite calm, reasonable leaders in John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Today we have, in my judgment, two rational but ruthless, occasionally impetuous, often rash leaders in Kim Jong-un and Donald J. Trump. Moreover, we always worry in political science about yes men telling authoritarian leaders what it is that they want to hear. And therefore, even a rational leader might get very poor advice if he surrounds himself with yes men who will be punished if they give contrary advice to what the leader wants to hear, and that over time will create more and more incentives for people not to speak truth to power, but to tell leaders what they want to hear, even if what they want to hear is inaccurate and wrong-headed. In 1962, we had the XCOM deliberately designed to have alternative perspectives, and John F. Kennedy would leave the room in order to encourage people to speak their mind, and deliberately held his own cards close to his chest so as to encourage diversity of opinion. Contrast that to the first cabinet meeting of Donald Trump, which anybody who studies authoritarian regimes felt really squeamish watching the competition to see which cabinet member could be the more obsequious in their praise to the president, with the exception of Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense, who said, "Oh, I'm so proud to be serving the U.S. military today." Everyone else referenced the president and his election. A third difference is that in 1962, the military was the problem. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended an airstrike and invasion of Cuba, and were overruled by strong civilian control. And that fits into the tradition of civilian control over military. Military advises when to go to war, or advises how to fight, advises when to go to war, and the civilians ultimately make the decisions. And John F. Kennedy insisted, not always with 100% success, that the military operations be well managed. We still had a U-2 that flew into Soviet airspace in the middle of the crisis accidentally. We still had U.S. submarines dropping practice depth charges on Soviet submarines, destroyers dropping practice depth charges on Soviet submarines, not knowing that those submarines had nuclear torpedoes on board. There were military operations that nearly got out of control, but civilian control still held forth in terms of what the final decision was, to have a blockade rather than an invasion and airstrike. Today, as I will try to convince you, the military is not the problem. The military may be the solution, but that puts us in a very uncomfortable, different relationship of civil-military relations than we are used to, and that I think is healthy. This is not a healthy condition in a democracy, but it may be the right thing to do today. We know that yesterday, President Trump canceled or postponed the Singapore summit because, as he claimed, because of the tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your most recent statement. That is the Deputy Foreign Minister's statement calling Vice President Pence a political dummy or an ignorant and stupid person, depending on your translation of the Korean. But I want to suggest that if you look at what's happened over the last few weeks, or actually over the last 6 months, the threats that the United States has made have really been quite extraordinary, in that we should be careful not to become inured to the defiance, the disregard for international law, and the replacement of diplomacy with bullying behavior that the president has repeatedly exhibited. American presidents have often threatened to use nuclear weapons, but they have mostly threatened to do so in retaliation. Not necessarily in retaliation to nuclear use, but in retaliation to an attack, an armed attack, in the name of deterrence. Where President Trump has crossed the line is in the repeated statements that they may not make any more threats. They, as he put it here, best not make any more threats. And Vice President Pence, Secretary of State, repeated multiple secretaries of state and national security advisors now have said that we will not tolerate North Korea having a capability to attack the United States, which is a way of saying we are threatening to engage in preventive war, not retaliation. And when you use terms like all options are on the table, for North Korean, that implies nuclear threats as well. George W. Bush famously said with respect to Iran, all options are on the table. When asked, are you saying that nuclear threats are on the table? He said, all options are on the table. The euphemisms that are used should not blind us to the seriousness of these kinds of threats in other people's eyes. Lest you think that is reading into the evidence, let me point out that earlier this year, John Bolton, prior to his appointment as the National Security Advisor, wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal called The Legal Case for Striking North Korea First, in which he argued that our definitions of preemption, which classically means to attack in an anticipatory way when an attack on you is imminent and unavoidable, is no longer appropriate, and that we should consider preemption to be when a country has developed capabilities that threaten us. That is his way of trying to erase the distinction between preventive war and preemption, or to try to conflate the two, as he did in 2003 prior to the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, he tried to make this argument. I did not take it too seriously at the time because I thought there's no way that he would be chosen to be National Security Advisor. But then when he was, my colleague and I, Alan Weiner, wrote a piece for the New York Times pointing out that the United Nations has a term for attacking when another country is threatening you. It's called aggression, and it's against the UN Charter. And I, for one, do not believe that one should always follow the law. I would be willing, for example, and I think Israel was correct in 2007, to bomb the Syrian reactor that was discovered that was clearly a nuclear weapons production reactor, been built illegally, covertly by the North Koreans. They did it in a way to try to minimize casualties, although there were some. And they should have, in my judgment, said this was illegal, but legitimate, appropriate. And I think in some ways the United Nations, by having no one condemn Israel for doing that in 2007, tacitly understood that. But not only would an attack against North Korea today be illegal, but I think it would be stupid because they have a capability. They're not building a reactor. An attack trying to get rid of their nuclear capabilities, as I will show momentarily, would likely trigger a massive war with enormous fatalities. Mr. Bolton began the current crisis within his first month in office by stating on April 29th on television that he wanted North Korea to be like Libya. A Libyan model was a shorthand, and to give him credit, he did not talk about killing Gaddafi. He talked about complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. You know the Pentagon's getting serious when they put an acronym around something, CVID, CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. And he argued that we have to have that, and then we can have sanctions lifted. So he was talking about the timing, the sequencing of a potential deal. But it was President Trump who actually turned Libya from a metaphor for complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament to a code word for regime change, a code word for preventive war, and maybe even by personalizing this with respect to Colonel Gaddafi, maybe it was even a code word for sexual mutilation and murder. And then made the threat that that model would take place if we don't make a deal, most likely. The ease by which one can talk about such things if one uses euphemisms is quite striking. And again, I wanted to discourage you from being inured by this kind of language, to really realize how serious this is. So it was Vice President Pence who, earlier this week, tried to repeat the position, sticking close to the president's views. I don't think he was straying from the president's views. He was repeating them in saying that Kim Jong-un, if he makes a deal, won't end up this way, but if he will make this way. And that's what caused the Deputy Foreign Minister to call Vice President Pence an ignorant person. So to my view, I don't know whether this represents a deliberate desire on the part of the White House to get out of the summit, fearing that it would be an utter failure, which I think it probably would have been, or whether this was really incompetent diplomacy, replacing diplomacy with bullying behavior, neither explanation is comforting, and both, I think, leave us with a real crisis on our hands. The first crisis I want to talk about is a hidden or barely hidden crisis in civil-military relations in the United States today. We have the extraordinary situation where the U.S. Senate has called for hearings on whether we should change the command and control structure of the U.S. military so that the president doesn't have the sole authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. That's never happened in the past that Congress has called for such a hearing. You also have a bill in front of both the Senate and the House initiated by Ted Lieu and Ed Markey, Congressman Lieu and Senator Markey, advocating that Congress be involved in any initial decision to use nuclear weapons first. I think that's highly unlikely that Congress will get involved, but I don't think it's implausible. Indeed, I think it would be quite reasonable to have some new rules put in terms of first use of nuclear weapons with respect to who would have the authority. Today, the president has sole authority because the system has been geared to respond to a retaliation in a rapid manner. So the Secretary of Defense should be called, will be on the line if there's an emergency call, but it's not required. And in exercises that have been declassified, sometimes the Secretary gets in the chain, sometimes he doesn't. He's not legally in the chain of command. And there has been a proposal put forward, which I wholeheartedly endorse, to have the Secretary of Defense put into the chain of command and to have the Attorney General put in the chain of command for any first use of nuclear weapons by the United States. It's a complicated issue in terms of command and control and how to manage what is preemption versus what is anticipatory self-defense and what would be true first use, unprovoked first use, or not anticipatory first use. But I think that the hearings, rather than put pressure inside Washington to move forward on this, took away pressure because of statements that were made by the U.S. military. In particular, two generals whom I know quite well and who I have enormous respect, former commander of the Strategic Command, Robert Kaler, and current commander, John Hyten, both said that they would not follow an illegal order. Hyten commenting that every year I get trained in the law of armed conflict. And the law of armed conflict has certain principles: necessity, distinction, proportionality, unnecessary suffering. All those things are defined. I'd say I provide advice to the president, tell me what to do, and if it's illegal, what's going to happen? I'm going to say, Mr. President, that's illegal. And many people were reassured by these statements. And we should be partially reassured, but only partially reassured, because what they are talking about is jus in bello. They're talking about the laws of armed conflict as they see them through their JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General Corps, attached to the war plans. And the war plans are, because they have been vetted by their JAG lawyers in the Strategic Command or in the Department of Defense, are by their definition legal. So if the president orders an attack that's in the plan, it would be following a legal order. What the plans don't deal with is jus ad bellum, that is the question about going to war. So I think it is highly likely that a military officer who has been trained in our proper civil-military relations, if told that we want to initiate a war today and nuclear weapons, I believe, are necessary to destroy North Korean nuclear forces, would say yes, because his job, as he sees it, is not to determine whether going to war is appropriate. And I generally like the system that we have. And yet we have such a crisis because of the lack of confidence that the military has today in the president's decision-making that privately many military officers are very, very worried. This has put the military in a very strange situation. Admiral Scott Swift, in July last year, was asked what would he do if he was ordered to launch a nuclear strike against China next week. If Trump ordered him to do so, what Admiral Scott should have said was, that's a ridiculous question, I'm not going to answer it. Instead, he said, yes, I would do that. Because he's been trained to think that that's what the military should do. And we want the military to follow orders. But the current crisis creates a different kind of problem. And we're beginning to see some signs of this. It has been reported that Secretary Mattis, a four-star general, the Senate waived the normal rules to put him into the Secretary of Defense position, despite having only been retired for a few years, is not following the traditional bureaucratic practice of providing a range of options to the President of the United States. The normal bureaucratic practice, many of you who have been in the government will know, is to have one really extreme option on the right, one really extreme option on the left, and then have one or two in the middle that are reasonable ones and hope the president picks, or whatever decision maker picks the one in the middle. They can't do that today because they think it's likely that the president's going to pick the most extreme one. So under normal circumstances, you do that. Today, you're not presenting all the options. From one perspective, a traditional perspective, that's insubordination. Under the current crisis, it may be wise action. There's another problem with promoting so many military. My judgment is that the problems of having so many military people in senior positions, formerly National Security Advisor, or twice formerly National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security. The problem is not, in my judgment, that they make more hawkish decisions. The problem is that this is going to color decisions of people who are rank and file in the military, rising up through the system, to think that they're going to now have future jobs in administrations after they leave the military. So the professionalization that we've counted on to always get good military advice may be damaged over the long term by having so many military people accept post-government political jobs and be, frankly, far more involved in political campaigns than was the case in the past. That's not good for civil-military relations over the long term. But lastly, I think that the current crisis is so serious that there has been discussion, I don't know how true these are, that Mattis and McMaster, former National Security Advisor, tried to ensure that at least one of them was always in town in case the president made any rash or impetuous decisions. This, again, is not unprecedented. In 1974, during the final days of Richard Nixon's presidency at the end of Watergate, Nixon became morose, possibly unstable, and then Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger secretly told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, George Brown, that if Nixon gave military orders, Brown should contact Schlesinger immediately before carrying them out. That action was extra-constitutional, but it was wise. And I believe that we're in such a crisis today that Mattis and the senior military leaders should be prepared to ignore belligerent tweets to push back against impetuous policies and to resist any orders that they believe reflect impetuous or irrational decision-making by the president. Their oath, after all, is not to an individual president. Their oath is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and the Constitution includes the 25th Amendment, which lays out procedures on how to relieve an impaired president. So if a senior military officer believes that a decision is being made in an irrational way or in an impaired way, I think he has the duty to contact Secretary Mattis, who should call for an emergency cabinet meeting to see whether the cabinet approves of invoking the 25th Amendment. Now, there are more subtle ways in which the Department of Defense, oops, this is not going forward. Can I do this by hand? I disabled it somehow? I turned it off. No? It's a battery?
Okay.
How about,
Just escape. Okay, it just seems to have crashed a second time.
so if you think PowerPoint is difficult, imagine command and control for nuclear forces. Okay, I'll keep going. You have to imagine, there was a nice picture of James Schlesinger and Richard Nixon up there with Jim Mattis and Donald Trump. The military has pushed back in some, I think, appropriate professional ways. The kind of behavior I'm talking about just before this was, I think, is more hidden. But these are open signs of professional behavior pushing back against the president. The president has claimed that we're not going to permit North Korea to maintain its threats against the United States, its threatening capabilities against the United States, and has implied, as I've shown, that preventive war would be both legal and might be chosen. What you have in official Department of Defense assessments, I think, are more cautious notes. The Nuclear Posture Review, for example, and I quote here, says that although North Korea's missile forces are expanding and increasingly mobile, U.S. and allied missile defenses are increasingly capable against North Korea's missile threat, and the United States has the early warning systems and strike capabilities to degrade North Korean missile capabilities prior to launch. Now, there are two phrases in there that I want you to focus on, and they would have been bold if you could see them. One is to degrade. The military is providing its best professional advice that we might, they are saying, be able to destroy a lot of the nuclear capability, but not all of it. And that's an acknowledgement, I think, that a preventive or preemptive strike is unlikely to be completely successful. And I'm glad that they're doing that. The second term that was underscored was prior to launch, because that's acknowledging a preemptive or preventive strike option. And there's no reason to suspect otherwise. Congress, seeking clarification, asked the Joint Chiefs for their assessment of how confident could you be that you could destroy all of North Korea's nuclear capabilities, and asked them for an estimate of what would it take. And the answer came back last year saying we would have to occupy North Korea. Again, a professional cautionary note to those in the White House and the national security staff who've been arguing that we might be able to get away with this. Ah, so there we have. Thank you. So there's Mattis, Trump, Schlesinger, and Nixon. Here's the Nuclear Posture Review statement. The professional military and Secretary Mattis have also pushed back against statements that imply somehow that North Korea capabilities to attack South Korea and Japan are okay, but capabilities to attack the United States are not. And they've done that both by pointing out that they are our allies and we have treaty commitments, but also that we have 28,000 troops in South Korea. We have some 200 to 300,000 Americans living there every day. That contrary to Senator Graham's statements that he claimed was going, that were also shared by President Trump, that if there is a war, it's not going to be just South Koreans, North Koreans, and Japanese who will be killed, but there'll be a lot of Americans as well. And the military has always noted this in their, not always, but have often noted this in their official statements. Again, pushing back in more subtle ways. This has come up, I think, although the full details are not known, in what has been called the bloody nose strategy, where it has been reported that President Trump wanted military options, and when told that we cannot reasonably expect to destroy all nuclear capabilities, said, well, what can we do to show them we really mean business with a limited attack, and then deter their retaliation by threatening a massive response if they dare to respond to our limited attack. Here you have one such option that people have talked about, attacking a missile while it's being displayed before its test, a mobile missile. Here you should note, again, Kim Jong-un, as in the first picture, smoking a cigarette. Again, this may be a problem of yes men. Nobody told a communist leader that it's not a wise thing to smoke around missiles. But people have said, well, maybe we should attack one of their missile sites to give them a bloody nose. And there are two problems with this, as has been pointed out. One is that it is illogical to argue that Kim Jong-un is so irrational that he cannot be deterred in general, but he's so pristinely rational that after we attack him, then he can be deterred. So I've made this argument with some senior military people. They said, well, if we did this, we'd have to put some kind of warning attached to this, saying, this is a limited attack, it's going to be very limited, and to message this, to signal our intent. And that makes sense, until you ask, what would you do if the North Koreans launched a limited attack against South Korea and said, oh, this is a limited attack? Would you believe that? What do we know about North Korean command and control? Would they think that this is a limited attack or the beginning of a large-scale attack? Would it appear like a first strike? Moreover, this is a test missile, but if you actually hit a nuclear weapon in a limited attack, do we think that, do we know? We don't know. We are uncertain about whether North Korean missile warheads are 1-point safe. which means that if there is a conventional explosion nearby, there's some possibility that that will destroy the missile and just spread some plutonium around. There's also a possibility that it could create a nuclear explosion of the missile warhead or of the gravity bomb, if it's a gravity bomb on a bomber that's been attacked. Would that appear like a first strike? Or would that appear like a limited conflict? Moreover, we may be wrong about the state of their nuclear capabilities. There are disputes about whether North Korea today has the capability to put a warhead, certainly on the regional missiles, medium range and short range missiles. People are confident they could do that. Whether they could put it on the ICBM, people are debating that. And the idea that maybe if there was a war that nothing would attack the United States, what if we're wrong? Remember in 1962, the Joint Chief recommended the attack on Cuba based on the idea that that there were no warheads yet on the island of Cuba. They were wrong. There were. And they almost certainly would have been used had we attacked Cuba in 1962. Those who are advocating a preventive strike are assuming that, as Lindsey Graham put it, people would die over there but not over here in the United States, and they may be wrong as well. Certainly, Kim Jong-un's public statements have suggested that he feels confident that they could now attack the United States, and the closing of the test sites suggests that he's confident in their warhead reliability. Even if you just assume that one missile with one nuclear warhead got through, how disastrous would that be? The difference of a nuclear attack and a conventional attack is that you don't need a lot of warheads. You don't need the large artillery that North Korea has facing Seoul. A single weapon getting through would create death beyond anything that we've seen since the Second World War. This is my estimate using Alex Wellerstein's system called Nuke Map, where he takes the 1945 data of fire effects, not long-range effects, immediate effects, and maps them on to current information about cities. And you can take whatever kiloton yield you want. This is a 250 kiloton weapon airburst, and by his estimates would kill 622,000 people immediately in Seoul. A single weapon getting through to Tokyo would kill, if it hit downtown, 635,000 people immediately. And recall that the Joint Chiefs said we could degrade, not destroy, not eliminate nuclear forces. So one last option that people have considered is decapitation. Perhaps we could, in a first strike, kill Kim Jong-un. I think the president is hinting at that, deliberately or not. At least for some people in North Korea, it may sound like that when he talks about Gaddafi in this way, by making a comparison. But I want to point to you a very obvious and I fear probable solution to the decapitation problem is pre-delegated authority. I used to think that pre-delegated authority, that if the president is killed, other officers are ordered, pre-delegated to launch immediately, was something that might occur in a democracy where people had trust of the military, but certainly wouldn't occur in an authoritarian regime, until I read Saddam Hussein's transcripts, where he ordered exactly that if he was killed in 1991, telling his senior officers, I want you to launch all chemical and biological weapons we have against Saudi Arabia and Israel if I'm killed. We don't know whether they would have done it, but we have pretty firm evidence that they were ordered to do that. We have at least one North Korean defector who has said that North Korean officers have pre-delegated authority to launch artillery against Seoul if the war has started and they can't get authority directly from Pyongyang. I don't know, nor do I know if anyone in the U.S. intelligence community knows about other kinds of pre-delegation, but I think it would be foolish for us to assume that Kim Jong-un has sole authority or has not given some authority to others in this area. And that leads to only one option for at least the immediate term, which is deterrence. Now, those of you who may have read some of my work know that I'm not the biggest fan of deterrence. But when compared to preventive war, and when a country already has nuclear weapons, I see no other solution. H.R. McMaster criticized his predecessor, Susan Rice, in August 2017 for saying that we could tolerate nuclear weapons in North Korea, saying, and I quote here, "No, she's not right. And I think the reason she's not right is classical deterrence theory. How does that apply to a regime like the regime in North Korea? A regime that engages in unspeakable brutality against its own people, a regime that poses a continuous threat to the neighbors in the region, and may pose a direct threat to the United States with weapons of mass destruction, a regime that imprisons and murders anyone who seems to oppose that regime, including members of his own family." And my answer is that classical deterrence theory was developed exactly to deter people like that. But that classical deterrence theory should be adopted, as I suggest in a moment, to focus on destroying the Kim Jong-un regime, not the North Korean people. And even if we have deterrence, which I think we're living with today, we just haven't accepted it in the United States, we are still going to have problems. It's still a very risky strategy. This winter we had this incident that I think you all heard about, where individuals in Hawaii all received on their cell phones an alert saying that ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter, this is not a drill. That alert had been sent out because the officer in charge of the drill had been told by his supervisor that this is not a drill. So he sent out the message that he thought was appropriate at the time. Did the United States Central Command authorities panic in any way? Absolutely not. Why? Because we have highly redundant sensors, all of which said, no, there's no attack coming. Second, because we have responsible officers who said to their superiors, oh, there's this one screwy thing in Hawaii, but everything else is okay. We screwed up. Don't worry about it. We'll fix it. And because we don't really expect Kim Jong-un to launch an unprovoked nuclear attack against Hawaii. Imagine for a second what would happen if a similar kind of incident, not the same incident, but similar kind of false warning incident of a radar operator or a communications intercept occurred in North Korea. Do they have highly redundant systems of warning? Unlikely. Do they have officers who would speak truth to power and say, we really screwed up, sir? There's no attack coming? Or would they try to cover up? And lastly, unlike us, they actually do think the United States might attack them. Why? Because we keep telling them we might attack them. And that we are far less aware than we should be about the risks of provocation by our own actions. One difference today that I hope those of you who are interested in social media and the effects of cyber issues on national security can think about, which is an incident that occurred last September where there was a false warning with people getting, quotes, real-world non-combatant evacuation orders issued via text messages. in South Korea, going out to U.S. officers. As of this week, we still in the public domain do not know who issued that order. It was immediately contradicted by others saying, don't. This was a false warning. There's been no evacuation. Was this done by the Russians? Was it done by a private hacker? Was this done by the North Koreans to test the system? We don't know, but we're in a new world where we're concerned and should be concerned about other kinds of things. One last note is that I think we have to be very careful with our nuclear exercises and our military exercises. And here, I would note that the recent South Korean decision, unprecedented, as far as I know, to tell the United States that we will not participate, we the South Koreans will not participate in an exercise, a joint exercise that we've planned to have B-52s fly with U.S. and ROK, Republic of Korea, fighter jets crossing over South Korean territory. We wanted to do this just earlier this month, and it was reported on May 18th that the South Korean government said, no, we don't want to participate. You can do this with the Japanese if you want to, but we're not going to permit it. I don't think that was an entirely unwise choice on the part of the South Korean government, but I do think we should be aware that this shows a split between the United States and the ROK, and on top of the evidence that some of the sanctions are being weakened by China and Russia, which has been reported recently, it's a sign that Kim Jong-un has already started to win in terms of splitting apart the alliance. Two last points I wanted to make. One is that my defense of deterrence does not come easily, and it's an only temporary solution, it seems to me, and should be done in a way that is more lawful and more mindful of the principles of precaution, requiring that we take all efforts to reduce collateral damage while attacking only military targets. This is sometimes called the principle of necessity, sometimes the principle of precaution. And Jeffrey Lewis and I published an article last year which made the argument that we should, as a principle, state that in addition to following the principles of distinction and proportionality, that we should never target any target in North Korea or elsewhere with a nuclear weapon that could be destroyed with reasonable probability with a conventional weapon. And we left it to others to determine how expensive that would be in terms of conventional rearmament, how to best define reasonable probability, and how to determine the hardness of weapons. That's something that military officers should be willing to do. And I must say here, I was surprised that one senior officer who refused to go on the record told me privately, he said, I think this is a horrible idea. And I said, why? He said, because it would reduce collateral damage. I said, yeah, that's the point. That's why we want to do it. He said, well, if you reduce collateral damage, you're reducing deterrence. And I said, well, if you're using collateral damage for the sake of deterrence, you're using it strategically, it's no longer collateral. And he said, I don't want to go in print and make that argument, so I can only pass it on without identifying the argument. The Washington Post published the article, or a version of the article, with their title, The Common Sense Fix That American Nuclear Policy Needs. And the reactions ranged from people who said, I'm surprised we haven't done that already, or we should do that, to others who said, no, this would be really dangerous. And let me conclude with just one final note. I'd be remiss if I didn't try to answer the question about what's going to come next. But I'd also be dishonest if I said I really know, because I don't know. We are in uncertain and dangerous times. I think there will be an effort to keep sanctions on, but I think they're already being reduced because Kim Jong-un has appeared to be the reasonable person in this crisis. And the Chinese and the Russians don't like all of his behavior, but they don't like Donald Trump's behavior even more. There's been a reinstitution of the hotline between North Korea and South Korea, which is a good thing. But no hotline can solve the problem of a hot head. There may be someday in the future some kind of sequencing of some reductions in the reliability of the North Korean long-range missiles, some testing, notifications, or testing restrictions in exchange for we don't know what. But I think for a very long time we're going to be living with a dangerous deterrent in both the United States and in North Korea. And that dangerous deterrence will continue until there is regime change. And I leave it to the discussion to decide which regime change will come first, the one in North Korea or the one in Washington, D.C. I thank you very much. So you want me down here, or what's the norm?
Thank you very much, Scott. Professor Sagan has kindly agreed to take questions, and we can go for, I would say, about half an hour to about 6:30. There are microphones around the room. I will let him actually moderate the Q&A.
It would help me if you could identify yourself by your first and last name and your affiliation. That would be helpful for me. So please, gentleman right here.
Yes, Benjamin Graham of the Uwe Hero Center for Practical Ethics. I have two quick questions. Number one, with regard to Article...
Oh, get the mic.
With regard to Article 25 of the Constitution. It's very soft.
It's on.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I have two quick questions. Number one, with regard to using Article 25 of the Constitution to relieve an impaired president, I wonder if that is, in fact, at all an option, because it seems to me that it would be nearly impossible under most circumstances to agree upon what impairment constitutes. My second question is the view from Beijing. Do you suppose that for Beijing's purposes, a divided Korea and a nuclear North Korea is far preferable to, let's say, a united Korea, namely South Korea absorbs North Korea?
On the first question, we don't know. We've never had a 25th Amendment has never been invoked. People speculate that it would be really hard, but we would have to know what are the conditions and how obvious was it and how forceful were the people advocating it. This is not something that would be taken lightly at all, I believe, by Secretary Mattis or by the Vice President, but it would take extraordinary circumstances, as it should. It should only be invoked under extraordinary circumstances. But it would take the majority of the cabinet, so it's not just two individuals automatically evoking it. They have to call for an emergency cabinet meeting, and it's never been done, so it's unprecedented. We just don't know. I think that a united Korea without nuclear weapons should be the ultimate goal. I think that that's a long way off, because I think Kim Jong-un has done this quite extraordinary task of building a nuclear arsenal because he's afraid that the United States will force regime change. And what we have done repeatedly is reinforce rather than reduce that view on his part. So maybe someday over the long term there can be some kind of containment policy that could lead to a weakening of North Korea within, and the people could put pressure on the government, and under those conditions perhaps give up nuclear weapons. It would have to be a nuclear-free Korea, because I think the Chinese government would be as opposed to South Korea getting nuclear weapons as we are opposed to North Korea getting nuclear weapons. But I think that's way down the road. Gentleman in the back here?
Thank you, Professor Sagan. I'm from China. I'm a current student from here in BSG. My question would be like, do you really believe that the U.S. have the real intention to solve the North Korea issue? Because from my point of view is that such a, the ultimate enemy for USA is maybe China, and like North Korea is such an unstable element beside China. It could be U.S. can benefit a lot from the current situation because he can, like a lot of military start in South Korea is not only targeting North Korea, but also targeting maybe China. So, and also the recent movement of the President Donald Trump and also this U.S. and Korea military exercise before the summit is kind of make the North Korea really angry. So it's, from my point of view, maybe the USA is not have a real intention to solve the North Korea issue from some point of view.
I would make two points. One, I hope we all have a tendency, I think, to talk about other countries as if they are a single person with intent. And what I've tried to suggest to you is that there are different people in the United States who have different views about how to deal with the North Korean problem. Some who want to practice deterrence, others who are advocating, at least suggesting, preventive war as a solution. And I believe that both sides are genuine in their statements and that there's a debate being held at the highest levels. So there are two different intents, I guess, is the way to put it, and people are trying to bargain to see which one's going to win. But I would also note that living with deterrence is a hard thing. The United States in 1949 to 1953 or 4 had internal secret debates about whether we should launch a preventive war against the Soviet Union, going all the way up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefing the President. And it was determined first by President Truman and then by President Eisenhower that no, we were going to live with deterrence, even though this is an uncertain and risky strategy rather than preventive war. Between 1961 and 1964, the Kennedy administration and then the initial Johnson administration contemplated an attack against the PRC. Indeed, privately went to Moscow and asked the Soviets' advice that if we went and attacked the test sites in the People's Republic of China, would you go along with us in a conventional attack? And we're told, "Niet." What we're seeing is a repeat of that because it is very uncomfortable to rely on deterrence, but I don't see any other option. And I hope that that intent wins out, because at least over the immediate term, I think it's the best we're going to get. Brianna.
Thank you, Dr. Sagan, for that very interesting lecture. So a few weeks ago, I was asked to give a presentation on how the JCPOA could be a model for a future potential North Korean deal. And now both of those deals have seemingly fallen apart in very short order. So my question is
It was a model in that one sense, I guess. It fell apart.
True. So my question is this: when we examine the roots of the North Korean nuclear crisis and how it has evolved over time, are there any lessons that the U.S. and its allies can learn as it seeks to develop a potentially new and more comprehensive strategy vis-a-vis Iran in the event that the JCPOA does eventually collapse?
I'm going to have an inadequate answer there, but it strikes me that I wish I had gone to your lecture. I could just repeat it, but the lesson I would take is that the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, was a successful arms control agreement because it got the Iranians under a lot of pressure from international sanctions, not just U.S. sanctions. to feel that they would be better off mothballing their current capabilities, reducing their long-term capabilities, with a escape clause down the road. And the United States felt that it was better to have that rather than have Iran be so close to getting a nuclear weapon today. And the United States, frankly, thought if they break out at the end of the time, in 10 to 15 years, we'd still have the military option against them. And that is not a bad deal. So the lesson would be to try to do something like that with North Korea and sequence this. The difference is that North Korea already has gone a lot further, and the JCPOA still had difficulties about the Iranians feeling that they don't want every site to be inspected. So they had a complicated scheme whereby they would go and then there'd be an international commission that would be formed to see whether that site was a legitimate site that the IAEA wanted to investigate or whether the Iranians could do it. You could have something like that in North Korea because they would have legitimate reasons not to want the US or the IAEA or a special UN commission to investigate every single place in North Korea. So something like that could be done down the road. Individual right here, yes. Your name?
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm very grateful to you for explaining this issue so
I
so
wish
well.
I could be more upbeat, but it's a pretty sobering
It's
situation.
pretty sobering. And I'm Sarah Lazenby, and I'm an Oxford citizen. So I'm wanting to ask you about all the military bases which the Americans have, and then somebody said to me, and they're all armed with nuclear weapons. I'd love to know if they are all armed, and how the North Korean situation fits in with your defensive strategy against China, I assume. I was never surprised that North Korea was upset about you doing and having another exercise, and I'm delighted that South Korea decided to play into the situation, which was looking more hopeful. After all, they've got split families and have had for many, many years. So I could ask more questions, but I think that's enough.
The United States does have, as I noted, some 28,000, I think 28,500 U.S. troops in South Korea. They do not have nuclear weapons at the bases in South Korea. They were removed during the George H.W. Bush administration as a sign of goodwill, as a sign that we had conventional capabilities that we felt were adequate to deter North Korea. That said, the U.S. position has been and remains that we hold open the right to use nuclear weapons first if our conventional defense of South Korea fails. That's partly done as a deterrent to the North, and it's partly done as a reassurance to the South Koreans that they don't need their own nuclear weapons, because if push came to shove, if there were really desperate straits, we might use them. What's happened recently is really quite interesting, that polls have shown that South Korean support for getting nuclear weapons has gone up among the population, not necessarily among the government, although some senior officials have hinted at this. In the past, it's always been people who thought the United States would not use nuclear weapons that wanted to get their own nuclear weapons. Today, the growth in interest in acquiring nuclear weapons in South Korea comes from South Koreans who think the United States might use nuclear weapons precipitously. So this is a new dynamic that I think is only happening because of the recent statements by President Trump. It fits into defense. I assume you're talking about defensive missiles, the kinds of building.
All the bases, all the lily pads, all around the China Sea and in Japan.
We have bases in Japan. We don't have them on lily pads. We have ships going through the South China Sea. Yeah, no, we don't have bases in the South China Sea. We did have bases.
John Pilger wrong.
Excuse me?
Is John Pilger wrong?
Yes. Paul Schulte says John Pilger is wrong. Yeah.
He's wrong.
Yeah. Well, I don't know John Pilcher, so.
He's a very left-wing Australian journalist who is obsessively anti-nuclear and anti-American.
Paul, do you want to identify yourself so people have some sense?
I'm Paul Short, Birmingham and Kings.
So, there you go. The gentleman here.
Thank you. Giovanni Mazzarelli, doctoral student here. I have two questions. One is, if we consider the current disregard of the administration, the U.S. administration, towards treaties and agreements, what do you think it would take for the international community to convince North Korea to negotiate and accept an agreement, especially given the uncertainty about whether the agreement can be fulfilled? And the second one is, do you see any role for non-nuclear powers to put some pressure on nuclear powers?
Two very good questions. I believe, although I think the evidence is relatively limited, that a leader's commitments in one area gets translated by other leaders to say, well, this person will behave the same way. And that is one way of linking, not in the theoretical way that Brianna was trying to suggest about what lessons might we learn, but what might North Korea learn from our pulling out of the JCPOA. So I thought it was rather breathtaking that the president would, within days, literally days of pulling out of a treaty unilaterally, not a treaty, pulling out of an agreement unilaterally, would then say that the North Koreans are in a different situation because we would promise them that we would never take them out. And not seeing the linkage, or at least not claiming to see the linkage there, I thought was very strange. Is there anything the non-nuclear weapon states can do? Well, they are trying to do something I don't think it's going to work very well, which is the nuclear ban treaty. So frustrated with the, at least their view of the lack of progress on Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and calling for good faith efforts to eliminate, to work towards nuclear disarmament, many non-nuclear weapon states agreed to negotiate, and now some small number have signed or have ratified a treaty that makes it illegal to possess or to use nuclear weapons. They're trying to create an international norm, but no nuclear states, nor states that are members of alliances with nuclear states, have signed or ratified the treaty, and only one of them actually even showed up, the Dutch, at the agreement. So I think this will have symbolic meaning at best, and at worst will actually pollute the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because the non-nuclear weapon states there will say, we've done enough, and we just want to put pressure on the nuclear states, when in fact there are things that they could do, like ratify the additional protocol, which calls for additional inspectors, which makes disarmament easier. But the ban treaty does actually not require states to sign the additional protocol, which is a sign, I think, that it's weakening in some ways the non-proliferation commitments. Leah?
Hi, yeah, my name is Leah Matton. I'm in the Department of Politics and International Relations here as an MPhil student.
But next year we'll be at Stanford University, I'm proud to say.
Yes, I will, and I'm also very proud to say it. My question was about the sanctions regime. So you've talked about this necessity of needing to begin to reconcile ourselves with living with deterrence, as difficult as that might be. And my question is, where does that leave the international sanctions that have been built up around North Korea, and the implementation of which has been rather fraught? But do we continue to strive to implement stricter and stricter sanctions, or do those fall by the wayside as the international community becomes a little frustrated with the June 12th debacle?
Yeah, I don't know. I suspect the administration will call for sanctions again, and will say that you know, this has all been North Korea's fault, but I don't think they're going to get an international consensus on that today. So you can, as president, say things like, I'm ending this because of your angry statements. But I think the UN Security Council members have seen some of the things that the president has said and some of his advisors have said, and I think it's very unlikely that they're going to agree to the kind of sanctions that they've agreed to in the past. So it would be good if they could maintain those sanctions, but I think it's highly unlikely. Right here.
Sir, thank you for being here. Sir, maybe it's a dumber question, but it's to sum up maybe a bit. My name is Hector Fuentes, by the way. I'm from Venezuela, and I'm doing the MPP here at the school. What would you do if you were the preferred advice? If you were the preferred advice of President Trump, or if you were the president of the United States, what would you do? How would you proceed? Because we've seen the scenarios, but what do you think would be the best course of action?
Well, there are many different.
Tell him to resign.
Well, I would certainly do that, thanks, Daryl. And so, I think that the United States and the Soviet Union, with the help of NATO allies, adopted a very long-range, successful, not risk-free strategy of deterrence and arms control, and said that we don't know how to get rid of these weapons in a safe and secure way, but we're going to reduce reliance on them. We're going to cut the numbers way back. We're going to have complicated verification schemes, and there's a whole professional industry that's created around verification and arms control. It lost quite a bit of its steam after the end of the Cold War, as people at this university and my university and others said, oh, well, we can study Civil War and other problems, but the nuclear weapons issues, that's sort of solved. We don't really need to worry about that anymore. We need to worry about it again. And so, without going into details about what kinds of agreements might be possible, I'm a firm believer that you need to have some kind of arms control constraint and some kind of legal constraint to make deterrence to make it less risk prone than it would be if you just let the military design things as they would see fit for their operational reasons. In the back.
Thanks. I'm Jonathan Leader-Maynard. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Relations. Scott, I'd like you to comment on two additional risks, because your talk's obviously been so optimistic so far that I should throw additional risks in. Because, I mean, I think that the scenario where Trump radically escalates seems to me to still be relatively unlikely. It's still sufficiently likely that we should be very worried about it, but I don't see him as a person with actually that great forcefulness of will to make such a radical step under usual circumstances. But I think two things that might substantially increase the risk would be, one, if he's embroiled in a particularly intense domestic scandal of something like Watergate or something on a similar scale, or possibly just loses the election and is on his way out. Might there be domestic situations which would increase the danger of these kind of scenarios? That's the first question. And the second question is, I think he might be considerably more willing to escalate if he's taken the slippery slope first by using tactical nuclear weapons in a conflict around the world. We've already seen him drop the largest conventional weapon ever seen. Could you talk a little bit about the risks of a Trump administration resorting to tactical nuclear weapons usage in a conflict? Because I think that might substantially change the dimensions of the strategic crisis as well. Thank you.
I'll handle those in reverse order, Jonathan. First, on the tactical weapons, we lack most tactical nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Posture Review is calling to build them, but they won't be ready for a number of years until a post-Trump period. We do have some smaller yield weapons that are still too big to be called tactical weapons today, and I believe that when the head of Stratcom says that we follow the principles of distinction and proportionality, they actually have gone through the target lists and say that we're going to use the weapon with the lowest yield that will destroy that particular target with very, very high confidence. But I wouldn't call those tactical weapons. And the Nuclear Posture Review wants to build lower yield ones because the logic is that that will both reduce the nuclear threshold, make it more likely the United States would use them, and therefore heighten the nuclear threshold by making it less likely that someone would confront us in a way that would require us to use those nuclear weapons. On the radical issue, I don't know. I'm not a big believer in the idea that presidents go to war because they're trying to divert attention from other activities. We know historically that does happen sometimes, but not. I can't label an American president having gone to war under that cause, although McKinley might be one example in 1898. But I do worry about the following issue, which is that presidential threats in the name of deterrence can create commitment traps that the president feels he has to follow through on. That if Donald Trump, or any president, this is not a Trump phenomenon, says, if you do that, that's a red line, and I'm going to have to respond, and then you respond, then you're stuck. Barack Obama came close to ordering an attack on Syria, even though he really didn't want to do so because of this commitment trap problem, was only rescued by the Russians getting the Syrians to give up at least their active arsenal of chemical weapons. They still made other ones later on. John F. Kennedy, after the missiles were discovered in Cuba, said, I should have said it doesn't matter if they put missiles in there. But now that I said that the gravest issues would arise, I've got to do something about it. So that's not starting a war, but it's coming pretty close to doing so. This is the one good thing I will say about Donald Trump today. President Trump doesn't suffer from the same kind of problems of being worried about being contradictory. That for whatever reason, he has less of a commitment trap problem, that he can say something and back away from it, sometimes without apparently even recognizing how much he's backing away. At the same time, he can be vindictive, rash, and impulsive. So I do worry about the commitment trap problem, which is why I think rhetoric really matters in this kind of areas. Yes?
I'm wondering how much this crisis situation is discussed in America among the American population, how much they are aware of it. It seems to be here, everybody is talking about it, but from what I've heard, Americans are very concerned about things going on in America and don't really care what happens outside America. So if Trump ensures the bombs won't fall here, they don't care how many thousands will be killed outside the country, or they're not even aware.
I'd be cautious not to think of they as being all Americans. Quite clearly, Senator Graham was representing a portion of the public that is xenophobic, isolationist, and is part of the Trump base when he makes comments like that. Even that base should know, A, it's not necessarily true that no one would die here, and B, we've got lots of Americans living elsewhere. So I say that not to in any way reduce the seriousness of alliance relations, or not to treat Americans differently than South Koreans or Japanese who would die in the first cases of a war. But to appeal to those Americans who care less about that than I do, to say, no, you've got skin in the game too. And it is a battle to make Americans more aware of that. And when you have senators publicly denying that, it makes the battle even harder. I think people are very worried about this today. What you had in the most recent presidential trip to Michigan were people in the Trump camp at one of his rallies calling for a Nobel Prize, Nobel Prize, Nobel Prize, and he was lapping it up. So this was not an easy thing for him to do, to back away. But at the same time, I think he understood quite rightly that this was going to be a disaster going to Singapore, because he was not going to be able to get any kind of agreement that he could see as being reasonable. That is, given that he had repeatedly said, I'm not going to accept this, he was going to have to accept deterrence, otherwise he was going to have a complete failure in Singapore. But I think Americans are worried.
One last question.
One last question, I'll be short. I'll be brief.
Hi, my name is Andrew. I'm here studying diplomacy, diplomatic studies program. Great presentation. I really appreciate it. I'm coming from the U.S. government background, so I think I have a little bit different take than some of the other questions. My first point is I'm a little bit cautious about your personal views of Trump, and that he's a very repugnant person, and I get that. He's very extreme. He's very volatile. But I think if we start delving into hyper-sensationalism, it can start accentuating our own confirmation biases. We can start reaching for evidence that perhaps isn't there. So I would push back a little bit about the citation of Secretary Mattis not presenting options to President Trump, or that him and McMaster agreed to be in Washington, D.C. without, really verifying the sourcing of that information. I think when we start jumping for things like that, it gets a little bit worrisome. My other point is I think we should also be pragmatic and look at his actions. The actions are he's pursued with the most rigor the greatest diplomatic option over the last 2 decades. Mike Pompeo, the highest ranking U.S. official, met with the North Korean president. Since Secretary Albright, you've had the nuclear test site in North Korea be dismantled, and you have also had them return 3 American prisoners, which I think would be probably greater diplomatic accomplishments than you could say for the Obama administration. And I also want to rule out the fact that, the summit talks are not definitively over. I wouldn't jump the gun and say that option's done. One of my questions is about the solutions to this, because frankly, everyone knows North Korea, the situation is really bad, and it's been bad for a long time, and there's been other moments in the history of U.S.-North Korean relations which actually probably been worse. I think you could say 1994, 1968, the Cheonan incident, the artillery shelling of Yeongpyedo. There's been situations where we're been on the verge of war. So I wouldn't necessarily say this situation is much different. But again, my question to you is, let's turn over the keys. We've had our wish. Donald Trump is gone. President Clinton's in power. You're her advisor. What do we do? One critique of your assessment, which I've heard so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, is this assumption that North Korea's actions are driven by a belief that the U.S. is legitimately going to pursue a unilateral option. And I'd like to push back a little bit on that assumption, because if you get that assumption wrong, it could lead to a lot of disastrous results. The U.S. wasn't threatening North Korea in 1950 when they invaded South Korea. And if the assumption is that North Korea is getting nuclear weapons to act as a deterrent of their own to invade South Korea and threaten the U.S., and the U.S. can't respond to defend our South Korean allies, that could be a disastrous situation as well. So again, my question to you is, what is your policy recommendations for North Korea, and what are your underlying assumptions for those policy recommendations?
Well, we'll end on this because it's a slightly more positive note. First off, I tried to maintain that these are unconfirmed comments about Madison and the options and the notion that he and McMaster made this deal. I'm not meaning to verify that I've got inside knowledge on that. And I do give the administration some credit for offering to go to the negotiation table and sending the head of the CIA and then the Secretary of State to meet. I think that's a good thing to do. I think it was in the name of a rash decision to accept a summit that the president made, but I think they did make a good effort to move forward. I will just repeat that I've been an advocate of non-proliferation for a long period of time, and have even acknowledge that there are times where I think a preventive strike is appropriate, even if it may be illegal. Because I think new countries getting nuclear weapons are really dangerous, in part because of the concerns that they might use them as a shield behind which to take more aggressive action. But once they have them, then I think we have to shore up our conventional defenses and to respond in kind if there is a provocation, to have the capability to respond to anything that North Korea does across the DMZ, whether it's at sea or with tunnels or with assassinations, and that we should respond appropriately with and prudently to such actions. I don't think a preventive war is the right solution at this point. So I'd supplement deterrence with arms control and with strong, conventional, appropriate reprisal activities against anything that they have done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. As we wrap up, and before we wrap up completely, there are two people that I'd like to acknowledge, and I will give you the floor. So at the start, Mike mentioned that the lecture was in honor of Professor Henry Shue, and I just wanted to say thank you to Henry, who's not only here, but whose work we all admire and who has been a leader in this field and many other fields. I also wanted to acknowledge, and I know he wants to say something, the tremendous effort that Professor Cheney Ryan has put into organizing this event. So Cheney, thank you very much as well. But I know you also want to say something.
Well, one thing is to repeat. So I'm Cheney Ryan. I'm Cheney Ryan. I'm in ethics and law and armed conflict. I'd like to repeat what Michael said, but also something Scott said. We're very interested in re-energizing discussion of the nuclear issue here. And that was actually the origin of all of this, was we need to say more about it. And so I hope people will look out for the more things that we're doing on this issue and try and generate more discussion about it. The other thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the help of the Blavatnik School and also Gwen Whidden, who's sitting right behind, who has done an enormous amount of work for a number of things this weekend. So I'd like us to acknowledge her as well. Thank you.
And it really just leaves me to extend our enormous thanks and gratitude to Professor Scott Sagan for a fascinating lecture and discussion. Thank you so much for giving us the benefit of your expertise. Thank you.